Hello everyone, I'm Sarxos and this is my Victoria 2 Advanced Military Guide, Part 2. If you haven't seen the previous video, then there are links to it in the description and maybe elsewhere too. In that video we went over every land unit type in the game, and in this video I'll move on to talk about how to actually use these units in practice. But before we do that, I'd like to make a small correction. In part 1, I talked about how backline units end up doing the vast majority of the damage in defensive battles, especially in the late game, whereas in offensive battles they do comparable damage to the frontline units. Well, it was brought to my attention that the unit stats as displayed in-game are a bit misleading, because every unit type actually has a hidden base attack and defense of 10, which is added to the attack and defense that is displayed in the interface. This ends up making a massive difference for backline units such as artillery, because that extra 10 attack and defense gets multiplied by their support stat when fighting in the back row. This gives artillery an effective damage output of 23 to 26 in the early game and a whopping 84 to 156 in the late game. For comparison, late game infantry deals just 28 to 30 damage. So even in offensive battles, artillery massively overshadows the frontline units, contrary to what I said in my original video. Fortunately, this doesn't really change my overall conclusions about when to use which units, except maybe that it puts an even greater emphasis on prioritizing cheaper units for the frontline compared to stronger ones. Well, with that out of the way, let's move on to our regularly scheduled content, namely how to use land units during war. The two most important parts of warfare are land battles and sieges, and I'll dedicate roughly one half of the video to each of these. So let's kick things off by talking about land battles, starting with general army composition. Army composition is one of the most crucial factors to being successful in land combat. You might have heard of the classic 4 infantry, 1 hussar, 5 artillery stack being presented as the optimal combat stack, and honestly it's for a good reason, because that is a very solid composition to fall back on. But it also oversimplifies things a bit, because when it actually comes time to engage in battle, the optimal number of troops to send in is going to be affected by things like combat width, terrain, and the number of enemy armies. Therefore, let me present 4 rules that will ensure you make the most out of your available armies in just about any battle. 1. Send in enough backline units to match the size of your enemy's frontline. This of course depends on the number of enemy frontline units, but is also limited by the current combat width as decided by technology and terrain. Calculating the exact length of the frontline in any given battle can be a bit complicated, so a quick rule of thumb is to check your own base combat width on the Warfare tab and send in that many regiments, unless the number of enemy frontline units is clearly lower than that. 2. Send in at least as many frontline units as you have backline units. This is to ensure all units in the back row are covered by units in the front row. 3. Send in at least 1 cavalry unit. This is to make sure you get the Recon bonus to remove enemy dig-in. 4. If you're fighting in a province where the enemy has a fort, send in at least 1 siege unit too, to help negate the fort bonuses. If you follow these 4 rules, you'll almost always be doing the most you can in a given battle in regards to army composition, though there are some minor details I left out which I will talk more about later in this video. However, keep in mind that your regiments will suffer damage and you might need to be ready to send in additional troops to maintain the desired balance, which leads us to the topic of reinforcements. The number of regiments that are able to take part in a battle at once is limited by the combat width, so if you send in more troops than there is room for, they won't actually do anything. Rather, they just wait in reserve until more room opens up on the battlefield. The problem with that is, units can't replenish strength or organization while they're in a battle, even if they're not actively fighting. This brings us to a very useful technique called army cycling. Army cycling is when you only send in enough troops to each battle to fill out the combat width, while keeping reserve armies on standby in adjacent provinces. Once an army in the battle has been worn down to the point that it can no longer fight efficiently, you send in a fresh army to take its place while letting the first army retreat. By continuously cycling armies in and out, you can let a portion of your army regain strength while another keeps the battle going, thus increasing the total time you can remain in combat. This becomes especially important later in the game as combat width decreases, since fewer units can fight at once in any given battle. Just remember to leave at least one army in combat at any given time, because if you retreat with all of them at the same time, you will obviously lose the battle. When reinforcing battles, you want to be careful to avoid having your backline units end up in the front row. When a battle is first engaged, all involved armies will automatically arrange themselves with frontline units on the front row and backline units on the back row. So as long as you have at least as many frontline units as backline units, the latter will always be positioned safely behind the former. However, when a new army joins an already ongoing battle, every unit will initially arrive on the back row, regardless of what type of unit they are, and only move to the front row on the next day. This means that the frontline units in the new army won't have a chance to cover the backline units they arrived with. So if there aren't enough frontline units in the battle already, those new backline units will be forced to the front row. To avoid this, whenever you want to reinforce an ongoing battle that doesn't already have enough units in the front row, split the reinforcing army in two, with the frontline units in one army and the backline units in another, and make sure that the backline army arrives at least one day after the frontline army. This will give the frontline army time to move onto the front row, so that the backline army can fill up the back row when they get there. This requires some tedious micro, but it can seriously make a massive difference. Yet another thing to be wary of when you want to reinforce a defensive battle is related to digging. As I explained in part 1 of this series, any digging bonus that the defending army has at the start of the battle is bound to gradually decrease over time. But if that defending army receives reinforcements from another army, then all their digging will disappear instantly. For this reason, if you're the defender and still have a significant amount of digging left, it might be better to avoid sending reinforcements unless you're seriously outnumbered. Once your digging bonus has been almost depleted, then it's safe to send in the reserves. But what if a battle goes south and you find yourself on the losing side? Well, then you'll need to know about retreating. As it happens, Victoria 2 is quite generous when it comes to retreating. After the mandatory first 11 days of battle, you can order a voluntary retreat to any valid province. A province is valid for retreating if you have military access to every province on the way there, and there are no enemy armies standing in the target province. And that's it, those are the only restrictions. It doesn't matter how near or far the province is, it doesn't matter if it's in friendly or hostile territory, and in fact it doesn't even matter if there are enemy troops along the path to the destination, only if there are troops in the destination province itself. So if you ever find yourself in a losing battle, take a moment to consider whether you want to remain close by, retreat deep into your own territory so you can safely regroup, or just take the opportunity to waltz right past the enemy front line to occupy their heartland. So that's great and all when you're on the losing side, but it sure sounds annoying if the AI were to do that when they're the ones losing. Luckily, they don't. Even though they probably could, they just don't. Instead, the AI always tries to retreat to an adjacent province if any is available. But if no adjacent province is available, either because they don't have military access or because their enemies have armies standing there, then they sort of just give up and die. Which brings us to the topic of encirclement. In this game, battles can end in 3 different ways. 1. Either side runs out of strength, i.e. battle-ready soldiers. 2. Either side of the battle runs out of organization. 3. Either side orders a voluntary retreat. If the first option happens, then that will obviously result in the losing army being destroyed. As for the second option, what happens next can be a bit hard to predict. Either the army will be instantly wiped, or it will do a forced retreat. I think there is some underlying logic that decides which result ends up happening, but despite experimenting with it quite a bit, I haven't been able to entirely figure it out. Either way, when doing a forced retreat, the player has no control over where the army goes. Rather, it will act as if it was under AI control and retreat to an adjacent province. If no adjacent province is available, the army will get wiped out no matter what. This is where encirclement comes in. If you're fighting an enemy army that is too large to get wiped out the normal way in a single battle, You can try to encircle them by placing armies in every province around the one where the battle is taking place. This will make the AI unable to retreat, and the army will therefore always get wiped out when they lose the battle, no matter how many troops they have. You don't even need a lot of units in the adjacent provinces. Literally one single regiment per province is enough, even if it's not at full strength. So that's how you can finish off an enemy army once you've got them pinned down, but first you need to catch them. To that end, let's talk about army movement. Here are some things that are useful to know. If an enemy army is about to move to another province, and you order your own army to move there too, the AI will cancel their movement unless they are confident they can win a battle. But the AI always takes one day to react to your actions, so if you start moving your army on the day before their army arrives, they won't have time to cancel their movement. This might seem rather insignificant, but especially later in the game, armies will be moving very fast across land thanks to railroads, so one day may very well be the difference between catching an army or letting them slip away. Also, if the enemy is attacking one of your smaller armies and you want to reinforce them with a larger one, then every day counts, as the longer your reinforcements take to arrive, the more damage your smaller army will suffer. This scenario is not too uncommon, and sometimes it can actually be advantageous to intentionally set it up, such as by placing a small stack on a mountain province as bait. Then when the enemy moves in to attack them, you quickly reinforce with more troops, thus gaining the defensive terrain advantage. This is also one instance where the movement speed of different unit types may come into play. The movement speed of an army is always decided by the slowest unit they're in, so faster units usually can't take advantage of their speed. However, in some cases where you really need to get at least some regiment into a certain position as quickly as possible, it may be worth it to split off your faster units into their own army and let them run ahead. Cavalry units tend to be the fastest ones, so they're usually the ones you'll want to split off in these situations. This trick can often be used to run ahead of a retreating enemy army after you beat them in battle once, so that the next time you fight them you get the defensive advantage. Speaking of defensive advantage, as you probably know, the defender in a battle is determined by whichever side of the conflict was present in a province first. But what happens if two opposing armies are moving toward the same empty province and are set to arrive on the same date? Is it just random who gets to be the defender? As it turns out, it's not random, but is in fact determined by the tag order in the game files. Within the game's file structure, there is a file called countries.txt, which lists every tag in the game. The order of the tags in this file determines in what order the game processes and updates the state of each country every new day tick in-game. If two armies from two different countries are set to arrive somewhere on the same day, whichever country is listed higher in this file gets to move first. This effectively serves as a hidden advantage to countries high up the list, as they have a better chance to become the defender in battles, or to catch up to the fleeing enemies, or escape if they're the ones being chased. Knowing roughly where your country lies in this list can be useful for planning your army movement. While it's difficult to memorize the whole list exactly, you can still learn some general guidelines. Rebels are at the top of the list, followed by the major powers of the world, after which it's mostly sorted by geographic region. Europe comes first, then Africa, then Asia, then the New World, and right at the bottom of the list are the dynamically generated dominions that can be created by colonizers. If you're playing a mod that adds new nations, you'll have to go in and check the corresponding countries file in the mod folder to learn the tag order in that particular version of the game. That's most of the things I had to say about battles, but of course battles are only one part of warfare. So let's move on to talk about another important aspect, namely sieges. The basic gist of sieges is pretty simple. Have army. Put army on province. Wait while army does siege. Province now occupied. But if you really dig into it, there is of course more to find. The time it takes to occupy a province is affected by the following. The number of regiments in the besieging army, the highest recon value among the units in the besieging army, the recon efficiency of the army, the fort level in the besieged province, and, if there is a fort in the besieged province, then also the highest siege value and the siege efficiency of the army. So, let's first talk about the recon and siege stats. I've already talked a bit about recon and siege in part 1 of this series, but let's expand on it a bit further here. Recon increases the occupation speed of an army based on the unit with the highest recon in that army. So if you have, for example, one unit with Recon 1 and one unit with Recon 2, then the occupation speed will only be affected by the one with Recon 2. Each level of Recon doubles the current occupation speed. Recon efficiency is a number applied to each army based on the proportion of units with Recon versus units without Recon. To get 100% Recon efficiency, you need to have at least one unit with Recon for every 9 units without. In other words, at least 10% of the units in the army needs to have Recon. If there are fewer Recon units than that, then the Recon efficiency will drop, which in turn lowers the occupation speed bonus. A similar principle applies to the siege stat. The effect is based on the siege value of the unit with the highest siege in the army, and to get 100% siege efficiency, you need at least 10% of the regiments in the army to be made up of siege units. Siege doesn't directly increase occupation speed, but rather it counteracts the effect of fort buildings. Forts reduce the occupation speed of hostile army based on the fort level, with higher levels reducing the occupation speed more. The siege stat reduces the effective level of the fort by the same amount as the siege value. So to completely nullify a fort, you need to have a unit with a siege value equal to or greater than the fort level. If the siege value is higher than the fort level, it will have no additional effect. The final thing that affects occupation speed is army size. And this is where things get a bit weird. Broadly speaking, the more units you bring to a siege, the faster it will go, but it's not quite as simple as that. Having only one regiment on a siege is slowest, as expected. Having 2 regiments is significantly faster than having 1, and 3 regiments is even faster than that. But if you then go to 4 regiments, the occupation speed suddenly drops sharply compared to 3 regiments, and in fact is even slower than having just 2 regiments. 5 regiments is faster than 4, but still a bit slower than 3. Then once you hit 6 regiments, the occupation speed is once again faster than 3 regiments. After that, the occupation speed keeps gradually rising with each regiment you add, albeit with diminishing returns, up until you hit 13 regiments, at which point it doesn't decrease any further. So what's the reason for this bizarre occupation speed curve? To be honest, I'm not exactly sure. However, there are some values in the defines.lua file for Vic2 that might hint at an answer. The variable siege brigades min is described as the number of brigades needed for a siege to progress at normal speed, and just so happens to be set to 3. My guess is that the game's code uses 2 different base occupation speeds, one which is applied to an army of size 0 and one which is applied to an army with more than 3 regiments. Each base occupation speed then has modifiers applied to it for every additional regiment, increasing the speed by some multiplier. It was probably meant to be balanced in such a way that the army would receive a significant boost to occupation speed once it exceeds 3 regiments in size. But due to improper balancing, it just so happened that the size 0 base speed plus the speed modifiers from 2 or 3 additional regiments actually resulted in a higher speed than the size greater than 3 base speed on its own. That's why we can observe a sharp drop in occupation speed once we go over 3 regiments. However, this is all speculation on my part. I don't actually know for sure. With all of this in mind, when you distribute your siege stacks, you want to make sure they either have 3 regiments or fewer, or about 7 regiments or higher, or else you'll be wasting occupation efficiency. 4 regiments is obviously the worst number of all, but even 5 or 6 is still less efficient than just splitting them up into several 2 or 3 regiment stacks and occupying more provinces at once. I should note, however, that while I've been talking about number of regiments for simplicity's sake, the occupation speed is actually determined by the number of soldiers. So if you have 4 regiments at 75% of total strength, they will have the same occupation speed as 3 regiments at full strength. Each full strength regiment has 3,000 soldiers, so the tipping point where occupation speed suddenly drops is when you exceed 9,000 soldiers, regardless of how many actual regiments you have. But it's usually easier to think of it in terms of number of regiments anyway, since reinforcements and attrition tend to make the exact numbers fluctuate a lot. Speaking of which, let's now talk a bit about attrition. Every province has a certain base supply limit which can be increased by various modifiers, and if an army has a larger supply weight than the supply limit, then it will take attrition. On top of that, when you're besieging a province, you'll always suffer a flat 2% attrition no matter the supply limit. Base supply is determined by the terrain and level of infrastructure, i.e. railroads, in a province. It is further modified by certain technologies, as well as province ownership and cores, giving you a higher supply limit in province you own and/or have a core in. There's also another modifier which is relevant to sieges. If you're laying siege to a hostile province, the supply limit in that province is doubled. This means that if you're marching a large army through an enemy province without stopping to besiege it, you'll likely suffer much more attrition than if you actually besiege it. However, this modifier is applied to the province itself, not an individual army, so if you leave at least one regiment behind to besiege the province, you can safely move any other armies through without suffering from the lower supply limit. Attrition is applied at the beginning of each month, but also whenever an army moves to another province. So unfortunately you can't avoid taking attrition in a low supply province simply by passing through it in between month ticks. Well, that's basically everything I had to say about sieges. And with that I've covered two of the most important areas of land warfare. However, there are still a number of relevant things left to mention, including army leaders, technology, and general strategy. So join me in the third and final installment of the series, where I'll be going into all of these things and more. Until then, thank you for watching and have a good time of day.